All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to today's lesson. As mentioned, today I'm going to be covering concepts of time. Now, specifically, I'm going to be talking about how to express specific amounts of time. Because, of course, in Toki Pona, it's relatively easy to talk about general amounts of time or about relative amounts of time. It's pretty easy to talk about yesterday and about a long time ago and a far time in the future. But it is pretty difficult to talk about, say, an exact amount of time, such as an hour. So we're going to be talking about a few different strategies you can use to talk about exactly an hour or exactly a minute. Now, we're actually specifically going to be starting with ilo tempo. Now, to be exact, this lesson is going to end up a little bit similar to my concepts and translation lesson from a couple of weeks ago. So if you wanted to express a specific amount of time, let's start with this first strategy wherein we're going to say, let's just borrow the word hour into Toki Pona. So our goal here is maybe to express tempo ola wan li pini la o kama. All right, this first strategy, as noted, is we're going to borrow the word hour into Toki Pona. And it certainly gets the job done in the sense that, yeah, pretty much anybody could read this and, of course, with a little bit of leeway given to the word ola being your borrowed word for hour, you could understand what's going on here. So, yeah, what we've said here is after 1 hour is finished, arrive. But there's a bit of a problem with that, which is it's not very satisfying to just borrow the English word. We can't consider this a solution if our goal is to speak Toki Pona, because then what you would end up doing is going, oh, well, I don't have a word for this in Toki Pona already. How about I just borrow it from English? And if you do that every single time, you end up with English again, right? So let's think about this again. But this time, we're going to relate the idea of an hour to physical concepts, to things in the world that you can talk about in order to express them to a friend. So let me clear the board. And we're going to try again at expressing an hour using a literal actual clock. Now, obviously, analog clocks have been going out of style for literally decades now, replaced with digital clocks, with phones, with any other way to tell the time besides two sticks in a circle. But nonetheless, these are a good reference and not non-existent, so we are going to talk about this one first. So, if you wanted to express exactly an hour passing, the best way to do that, given that you're both looking at an analog clock, will be to look at the specific items on the clock. In this case, you have a pretty obvious palisa lili and palisa suli. And we know that the palisa lili always travels around the clock in exactly an hour, and the palisa suli travels around the clock in exactly a minute. And so there actually is your strategy and your way to relate specific amounts of time to a physical object without having to borrow a word into Toki Pona. So you could say, palisa lili litawasike tula o kama. So in this case, we have a piece of context, palisa lili, that gives us some basis of understanding for what amount of time is passing. So long as you and whoever you're speaking to know you're talking about an analog clock like this, you're good. You know exactly what's going on. As in, you know which stick is being referred to, the little one, and you know how much it has to move for you to follow this instruction, right? Literally, when the small stick travels in a circle 2 times, arrive. That's the instruction. And following from that, we can make a lot of similar instructions, or we can otherwise express specific amounts of time. To be exact, we can use any property of this clock to refer to a specific amount of time, and we don't have to worry about having a specific word for hours or minutes or seconds. Of course, if you do have a second hand, it'd probably be the longest and the fastest. But you can use your analog clock as a reference for specific amounts of time. You don't have to have a word for it. So let's try another example. First, we're going to back up a little bit and say we don't even know we're talking about an analog clock yet. So first, let's express to our friend, hey, what even is an analog clock? Well, you don't have one for a reference, but probably your friend does know what one is. So you could start by expressing ilo tempo sike la palisa tu lilon. Ilo tempo sike la palisa tu lilon. Literally, you're just here describing the properties of an analog clock. Because, of course, like I noted, maybe your friend, or maybe you don't have a physical clock there present to look at, but you do know what it looks like, and you could probably describe one to your friend in just Toki Pona. So there you go. You continue from there. Let's see. Palisa suli li tawa sike. I'm just going to shorten this to KPKN because writing is slow. Palisa suli li tawa sike kepiken tempo. See, palisa suli tempo lili. As one example, you can continue describing the clock by describing the specific properties of the sticks on the clock. So we can also describe palisa suli li tawa sike kepiken tempo lili. The small stick travels in a circle, as in literally circle moves, using a little bit of time, right? And of course, we can also go further to describe the small stick where palisa lili li tawa sike kepiken tempo suli, right? And so now you have a point of reference for what kind of time tool you're talking about, the fact that it's circular, it has two sticks on it, and how those two sticks move in relation to one another. And of course, on the tool itself. At this point, it would be kind of surprising if a friend of yours didn't recognize what you were describing as an analog clock, right? And so long as they do, you're set. You can begin describing specific amounts of time using that analog clock as a reference, using the sticks on the clock. So we're going to do at least one more example. What if you wanted to say, after exactly an hour and 30 minutes? Well, probably the simplest way to do this would be to use two law clauses where you specify one amount of time passing and another amount of time passing. Alternatively, you could describe it in two sentences and then say ni tula to clarify that both of them apply equally to the following sentence. I would prefer this method, and that's what I'm going to describe. So, an hour and 30 minutes. Palisa lili li tawa sike wan, palisa suli li tawa sike mute luka luka. Literally, the small stick travels in a circle one time, and the large stick travels in a circle 30 times. Assuming, of course, you're using Nasinnan Papu, which describes mute being 20, luka being 5. If you're not doing that, you could say 2 15 times. You could also potentially use the word 2 as a way to divide a clock in half, and then describe it traveling by half of the clock. That is another option. Or excuse me, you could describe the palisa lili by traveling half of the clock. That's another option. In this case, you can be precise with the exact numbers using Nasinnan Papu. All right. So we have our two reference points for the amount of time passing, and then the instruction. Ni tu la o kama. Easy enough. So literally, in the context of the previous two things, arrive. And so, yeah, we can describe essentially any specific amount of time that is necessary using an analog clock. Now, analog clocks are definitely going out of style. They are not nearly as popular as they were in the 90s, let alone before then, right? And normally people will have a phone in their pocket which has a reference point given in digital numbers, as in the literal actual time in hours and minutes with the numbers. So let's clear this and run through this exercise again with at least one more example, but that uses digital numbers instead of analog. So first, let's describe a digital clock. Ilo tempo la, nanpa tu li lon li pana e sona tempo, right? In the context of a time tool, two numbers exist and they give knowledge of time. Ilo tempo la, nanpa tu li lon li pana e sona tempo. Of course, you can always go to more detail about which numbers, about how they're laid out. In this case, we would like to be clear about how long it takes for each number to change, and then use that as a reference point for hours and minutes. And so, we can say, nanpa pi poka wan li ante lon tempo suli. So, nanpa pi poka wan li ante lon tempo suli. Here, we're providing two critical pieces of information. The first being that we are providing a side for each number. In this case, the number of one side changes in a large amount of time. Here, we're describing that the number on the left side of the digital clock, not literally left, mind you, but on one side of it, is changing in a large amount of time. So we're giving somebody a reference point to know, oh, if they refer back to Poka 1, that's the number that refers to hours. And if they refer back to Tempo Suli, that's also hours. We're connecting more pieces of context to this idea of the digital clock so that we can express further information about it. And you can see where I'm going with this, where we could then describe nanpa pi poka tu li ante lon tempo lili, right? As in, the number on side 2, or on the 2 side to be literal about it, changes in a short amount of time. The minutes side changes very quickly. And now you have a reference for what numbers they are, what side they're on, and how quickly they change. At this point, we can essentially redo the same system that we had before, but now with numbers on the digital clock. So, we can say, nanpa pi poka wan li ante tu la o musi. For example, so we can say the number on the one side changes, changes 4 times, la o musi. When the slow-moving number, the number on the first side, changes 4 times, have fun. And you can give any particular instruction, of course. It doesn't matter which specifically you give. But the important thing here is that we can express specific amounts of time in the context of any sort of time tool. So long as you spend the time to clarify which things you mean by which constructs in Toki Pona, you can express essentially anything, right? And here is a demonstration of exactly that, where we essentially borrow concepts of hours and minutes into Toki Pona, but without having to borrow the words for them. We can express this amount of time using the behaviors on a physical clock. And you can do this with days, months, and years as well, although it does take a bit more effort. And the reason I would say it takes more effort is because generally there is not a physically changing tool that comes with this. That said, we can refer to weeks, days, months in specific and useful ways. And again, I'm going to relate them back to physical objects. So let's look at weeks. Now, you might be familiar with the fact that tempo pali, tempo pali, and tempo esun, these are both relatively common ways to refer to a week, right? And you can kind of see the justification here, because the first one is describing an amount of time that is defined by the work that is done in it, and the second one is describing the amount of time that is related to shopping, trade, bartering, whatever kind of economic concept, I suppose, right? And you can see the justification here and why these two do work. But there is also a pretty clear problem with both of them, which is that they depend a lot on how your actual week is structured, right? Tempo esun kind of assumes that you are structuring your week around other people's economic structures, around the necessity of going to work, right? But there are plenty of people in the world who work on a non-weekly schedule or who work on very irregular schedules, right? Additionally, tempo pali can refer to times that are defined by you actually doing some kind of working or creating, right? Not necessarily the entire working week, although that isn't a bad suggestion for it, but they can refer to you actually being at work while you are not home, not working on hobbies, not doing something else. Tempo pali, right? And so what you might want to do instead is consider what other physical constructs or objects or ideas you could relate a week back to. Now, my personal favorite actually comes from a calendar. Now, I'm not going to make that exact, but you can say you have whatever particular month up here, you have your days of the week laid out left to right, and conveniently, weeks are always structured in a single row. So if a month starts here or it starts here, doesn't particularly matter, you'll always have months in these convenient rows. Or excuse me, not months, weeks in these convenient rows. And this row happens to look a lot like a palisa. And so here's the trick. Lipo tempo la, tempo pali, and tempo esun li palisa lukin. Ni la, ni li tempo palisa. Literally, a working time and a shopping time on a time document look like a stick. So, because of this, you could say that a week can be tempo palisa. Again, so long as you were in the context of a calendar, a time document, right? If you have this bit of visual context for what a week could look like, you can give a reference point. And so, I wouldn't say that this works in a vacuum. In fact, if you are trying to discuss the concept of a week to somebody without having a calendar present, it would be generally better to say, tempo suna lukatu, as in 7 days, right? Because honestly, weeks are a little bit difficult to express. They're an organizational unit of time rather than one that fits neatly into some like natural phenomenon, right? Months are fairly related to the travel of the moon around the Earth, and years are fairly related to the travel of the Earth around the sun, but weeks are just kind of there. And yeah, they have some small basis in natural phenomenon that you could rely on, but at the very least, I don't know terribly many people who are familiar with that natural phenomenon, right? Which is to say, portions of times of the month. So instead, you can reference physical objects that are much more commonplace, much more available to you, and use that as a reference point to import, so to speak, weeks into Toki Pona without having to borrow the literal word week, right? And so you can see how this is also useful in the same way as the hour and minute examples that I gave before, where we borrowed those into Toki Pona and then used them to express specific amounts of time. Now you can express specific numbers of weeks that are passing. In the same way you could already pretty reliably do so with tempo suno to refer to days. All right, we're going to go ahead and clear that. And I will back up a little bit now to talk about days as well. Because, of course, the problems I described that apply to tempo pali and tempo esun that don't make them too good for expressing a week also apply to some degree to tempo suno. Tempo suno, let's put that up on the board, tempo suno has certainly a more reliable way of referring to a day as in 24 hours of time, or at the very least the time you are awake, because most of the time, that amount of time is heavily defined by you being awake for it, right? It's the amount of time it takes for you to get up, do your things, go to sleep. That's a day. Tempo suno. But if you interpret this statement as it exists in Toki Pona, this is a light time. This could refer just as well to the actual time the sun is out as to a 24-hour day, right? Similarly, it can refer to, say, when you're allowed to have your lights on, such as if your parents disallow you from having your lights on, right? After a certain hour of the day. That would be your tenpo suno. And so, if we wanted to disambiguate this further, if we wanted to be absolutely certain that somebody knew we were referring to a 24-hour period of time and not just a light time, well, we can go to the same effort to describe a day, a 24-hour period, as we did to describe hours, minutes, and weeks. So, let's do so. You can't expect, I don't think, every single person to be super familiar with how the Earth moves, even though this is very common ways of teaching. Wow, this is going to be the worst planet you've ever seen. Yeah. So, even though it is very common to teach how the Earth physically moves in space, it is, I think, not so common to think about this every single day. Certainly, I'm not so worried about the Earth's actual rotation on a daily basis. But there are other physical phenomenon that are really easy to refer to, which do happen on a daily basis, and generally, most humans are exposed to them, which is to say, the sun and moon. So if you wanted to refer to the 24-hour-ish period in which the Earth rotates as a day, as a tenpo suno, you could refer to the time it takes for the sun to rise, travel through the sky, the moon to rise and travel through the sky, and then for the sun to rise again. Or maybe for convenience, since the moon and sun aren't in perfect dichotomy, as you might like to think, you could simply say the sun rises and then rises again. So let's try that. Suno, li, lon, sewi, li, kama, sin, lon, tenpo, suno, open. The sun, suno, li lon sewi, li kama sin, lon tenpo suno, open. The sun is in the sky and newly arrives at the opening of light, at the time of opening of light, right? So here, we're relating the two physical concepts of the sun rising and the light coming, right? While expressing those, you both using the word suno, but making it clear that they are different constructs in the sentence by using different head nouns, right? Here, suno is the head noun, so you can clearly see that it's referring to some physical concept that starts with and is important to being a suno. Here, suno is modifying tenpo. It is some kind of time defined by light, right? And we can go further than that, of course, but now we have a reference point for what happens when the sun rises and what that looks like. And you can go to more effort to explain that, but now we can say, tenpo suno open li kama tu la ni li tenpo suno. Tenpo suno open li kama tu la ni li tenpo suno. In the literal sense, when the time of light beginning arrives twice, this is a light time. We're creating a specific definition, a kind of deriving what it means to have a tenpo suno, a 24-hour period of time. We're saying when the sun rises for the second time, that is a day. And of course, when it comes to, say, physical clocks, analog clocks, they normally restart at midnight. So this may not be a perfect definition for your purposes, in which case I would encourage you to explore what it means to reference time via a clock, right? Reference a day via a clock, to be exact. And in fact, you could do that as well. But in this case, we're relating it to physical constructs. And by describing, hey, when the sun rises a second time, that amount of time is a tenpo suno, we now have a reference point for a 24-hour day. Yeah. So let's move on to months. Now, again, this is one of those cases where tenpo moon is pretty clear about what you mean in a lot of cases. It's similar to tenpo suno in the sense that people will interpret this word moon to mean the moon in the sky, way more frequently than they will interpret it to mean the stars or another planetary body, even though it can mean that. But that doesn't mean it's impossible for them to interpret that, right? There's this degree of reasonability about it. So, when you're referring to a tenpo moon, you could just as well be referring to times when the stars are out. So, what if we wanted to be clear about this being a month, right? Well, months, as noted, are related to a physical phenomenon. For the most part, they line up with the moon traveling around the Earth, but more exactly, they align with the cycle of the moon becoming lit and unlit by the sun. And you don't need to be specifically aware of it being lit by the sun to be aware, of course, of it being lit at all. And so we don't need to go to the whole effort of explaining how the sun shines on the moon. All we need to do is explain that the moon is in the sky, becomes lit, it becomes unlit, and then becomes lit again. And then that process is what it means to be roughly a month of time. Now, as an aside, of course, that will go out of sync with an actual calendar, which is why we haven't really used a true lunar calendar in human history since, I don't know when. It's been a couple of centuries, probably. Lunar calendars have not exactly been terribly accurate throughout history, but nonetheless, we can use as a reference point for something very, very close to a month. So, tenpo moon. Here, we can say, tenpo pimea la moon walo li lon sewi li ken suno. Tenpo pimea la moon walo li lon sewi li ken suno. As in the dark time, the moon is, a white planetary body, so just to be generic, a white planetary body is in the sky and can be lit, excuse me. So now we have a reference point for what the moon is and where it is and what its properties are. Again, you can continue describing it, describing the fact that its surface is pockmarked with little speckles of gray, and you can describe more carefully its position in the sky related to other objects. You could describe the fact that it's sometimes out during the day, and you could describe the fact that sometimes it's a little bit larger in the sky or a little bit smaller in the sky. But ultimately, our goal is to describe the fact that the moon is there, usually whenever it's dark out, and that it can be bright. And so then we can describe the time it takes for the moon to change its brightness. And so we would say, tenpo la suno moon li ante tawa ala tawa ale. There we go. So in the context of time, the brightness of this planetary body, which in this case we know by the previous sentence which one exactly we're referring to. So in the context of time, the brightness of this planetary body of the moon changes to none and to all, right? And of course, if you were to look at the sky and observe the moon, you can see this for yourself. During a new moon, it's barely visible. There's your ala. And during a full moon, it's entirely visible and just about perfectly circular in the sky. That's your ale. Of course, this amount of description may not be sufficient for somebody who's never seen the moon, but I don't think I've ever met such a person who has never seen the moon, so we're going to pretend that won't happen. And as such, this is, in all likelihood, sufficient to describe the phenomenon of the moon changing in terms of its brightness, right? We're literally describing that over time, the brightness of the moon changes. It goes from completely bright to completely dark. And we don't yet specify exactly when it does so. We're only saying that in the context of time, it does so. Now, of course, here in this lesson, I've already described what it takes for, say, a day to pass. So you could take the time to reintroduce that concept and then use that as a reference point for about how long it takes. In fact, if you wanted, you could sidestep the idea of relating a month to the moon and then just describe that it's a certain number of days. That's also valid. You could also describe the changing of the moon in terms of a number of days, or in terms of a number of weeks, since I also described that as it appears on a calendar. In this case, however, we are going to continue relating it to the changes of phase of the moon. So, tempo la suno moon li ante tawa ale. Continuing, we can now say moon li kama suno ale lon tempo tu la ni li tempo moon. Moon li kama suno ale lon tempo tu la ni li tempo moon. Literally, when the moon becomes lit, fully lit on 2 occasions, this is a moon time. Now, obviously, we haven't gone to the effort of expressing the fact that the moon changes its phase slowly, but again, I don't think it's necessary to do so, although you could, because presumably somebody would be familiar with the passage of the moon and with its phases. So under that assumption, you can totally say the moon, which we were referring to in this conversation as just moon now, when it becomes fully lit on 2 separate occasions, that is about a month. Now, obviously, there are notable exceptions, such as the famous blue moon, a rare occasion in which the moon becomes a full moon twice in the same month. But even then, our goal is not to catch these corner cases. Our goal is to find an amount of time that is physically related to some phenomenon that we could describe that is still very, very close to the amount of time we call a month in society, right? Unfortunately, I did not quite have enough time to make it to years, but nonetheless, I think you can, at this point, spend the time to derive a process for yourself to figure out what it would take to describe to somebody how long it takes for a year to pass, given just this idea of introducing it into Toki Pona with physical concepts that are related to that amount of time. In doing so, you can continue referencing that amount of time in context with whatever needs you have, right? So you can give instructions for specific amounts of time, you can relate it to physical phenomenon, and something that I didn't note during this lesson that I would like to give a lesson on in the future is you could relate it back to your relative amounts of time, as in tempo kama, tempo pini, tempo pi io sin, whatever particular amount of time that you would like to refer to in relation to another object.
I had
Oh yeah, go ahead.
question. I had a question somewhere here. Yeah, it was about physically describing an analog clock to refer to time. That was smart, but a clock has 3 hands, and we only have lili and suli. So when you're referring to tempo lili, sorry, palisa lili and palisa suli,
yes,
how do we know exactly which hands they're referring to?
Yeah, so in that case where you have an analog clock that has 3 hands, it's totally valid to step back and refer again to the properties of those sticks. So remember how I also described the fact that the sticks move in different amounts of time, where I described that the little stick travels in a slow time, a large time, a tempo suli, and the big stick travels in a quick time. Well, the other big stick is also thinner, which is something you could describe, and you could describe it in relation to the other long stick being thicker. That's usually the case anyway. And you can also describe the fact that the thinnest stick also travels the quickest. Basically, you can spend more time to describe which properties of those sticks are relevant and then refer back to them, right? Honestly, probably the easiest and most consistent way to refer to them, just to be sure you don't mix them up, is to number them, right? So once you finish describing palisa lili, the small stick, the hour stick, that can be referred to as palisa nanpawan. And you can go on like that.
Okay, I also had something I wanted to add to the talk about the week. I think if you're like culturally aware of the Genesis creation narrative, you could also hypothetically call that tempo pipali sewi.
Tempo pipali sewi. That is true. Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, I personally am not super familiar with that story. I'm familiar with it on like a superficial level just because of like its particular fame, but I'm not really super aware of it aside from like it was a process that took 7 days. But yeah, if you have that common reference point, it's totally valid to refer to it that way. Ultimately, your goal in speaking Toki Pona is to begin describing things with some common reference point and then work your way into smaller units of speech, essentially, right?